This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Koren Publishers. Shloishim Yoim Kaidim L'Chag, Shoyelim V'Darshim Hilchas L'Chag. But Zrizim Makdim L'Mitzvah. So although this episode of the podcast is about Purim, and this is airing a little bit before Purim, so a little bit more than 30 days before Pesach, we want to talk about Koren and their various Haggadahs that they've published. It's never too early to start thinking about Pesach, so make sure you have something wonderful to guide you through the Seder this year. New for Pesach 2023 from Koren Publishers is the Shalom Rav Haggadah with commentary from Rav Shalom Rosner. But also check out their various Haggadahs that they have from previous years. The Haggadah of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rav Steinsaltz, Erica Brown, the amazing Koren Youth Haggadah, or the best-selling Passover Haggadah graphic novel, which comes from the same mind that brought you this year's instant classic graphic novel on Megillas Esther, which, by the way, if you haven't seen, you should check that out as well if that's something that interests you. So listeners of the podcast get 10% off their entire order from korenpublishers.com, which is www.koren, Koren, pub.com. So again, www.korenpub.com with code CHATTER, CHATTER. I'll put the information in the show's notes. So if interested, check it out in the show's notes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Purim Shpiel podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Zev Eleff, who is president of Gratz College, and we'll be discussing the history of the Purim Shpiel, Purim Rov, something that listeners may be familiar with in general or from Yeshiva, from the Yeshiva days. So thank you, Dr. Eleff, for joining me once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Purim Shpiel comes in all shapes and sizes. The whole ensemble, just the Purim Rav, a one-man show. I've been fascinated with the topic ever since I wrote the Ida Crown Jewish Academy Purim Shpiel back in, 2002 or 2003. And the notion of it and the impact and why it's there, the pushback against it, to me, it's one of the most fascinating elements of the yeshiva curriculum.
So let's just in brief explain what a Purim Shpiel is. We said a bunch of things there. I don't know if people. Let's assume maybe they don't know. What is a Purim Shpiel, a Purim Rav, and then we get into the history.
So, I think it's been translated in many ways. Bottom line, it's a lampoon. It is an opportunity in a very discrete, very specific amount of time to allow the inmates to run the asylum. Whether it be a Purim Rav, that's where we'll talk about it begins in earnest in the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Volozhin. Chaim Volozhiner is the great architect of the modern day Purim Shpiel. Some people date the Purim Shpiel back to the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, where Jews in Spain and France, mimicking a culture of Carnival, developed their own performances which mirrored the Purim story, or sometimes the story of Yosef HaTzadik, for example, with his brothers. You could count that as a Purim Shpiel, but in reality, it's none other than Chaim Volozhiner, who is the great architect of this tradition.
Now, one other general question: do we know where the word Shpiel comes from? Means exactly?
Play. Spiel means play. Entered into the Yiddish vernacular. So what happens? Reb Chaim Volozhiner and Shaul Stamford, the great historian of the Lithuanian Yeshivot, he writes about this in his book. It's first appeared as his dissertation, then in Hebrew, then a revised edition, then the Lippman Library happily translated it to English a number of years ago. They all say the same thing. It's all wonderful, which is that that Reb Chaim Volozhiner saw a great benefit in appointing usually the top guy in the yeshiva, also the wittiest, happened to be, as the Purim Rav, and he would put on a performance. And that would allow Reb Chaim Volozhiner to get a critique, because you couldn't do that, right? You can't, Talmud can't tell the Rosh Yeshiva what works and what doesn't about a particular Maggid Shir. Maybe about the food, and there was no dormitory in these in Volozhin, but in boarders' homes. But to allow a window where it was controlled anarchy. There was still a level of respect, sure, but it was a time of controlled irreverence in which this Purim Rav or Purim Gabbai would be allowed to lampoon some of the goings on in the yeshiva in Volozhin. And there are wonderful stories. One of them involves it's told by presumably under many people, many Talmidim who became great rabbinic scholars in their own right, about the iteration, the incarnation of the Yeshiva in Volozhin and leadership of Zev Eleff, for example, in which the Purim Rav delivered a shir. Everybody looked around and it wasn't very funny. They turned to Rav Itzela and Rav Itzela said, "Don't you get it?" What he said. There is no such Yerushalmi and there is no such Rama. But more often than not, it wasn't the case. It was an opportunity to get an assessment of how the yeshiva is doing. But really importantly, and this is something that I think is really important, is that necessarily the yeshiva for Shushan Purim, day after Purim, returns back to normal. Right? What happens on Purim stays within the confines of Purim. So it reverts back to normal. Authority is restored. But the Rosh Yeshiva received valuable feedback.
Okay, so first of all, Stamford's book in English is Lithuanian Yeshivos of the 19th century, from Lippmann. Now, we'll get to America. That's really, I should have said that at the beginning in the title of the podcast. We're discussing a lot of, you've written especially on the Purim Shpiel in America. But like
every research question I have ends in America.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll just say that here. But okay, so in Volozhin, when did the Purim Shpiel take place? When did the Purim Rav get up and give his quote unquote shir? Because
No, it's a good question. We know sometime between the year 1802 and 1820, which was for as long as it was founded and when Chaim Volozhin is no longer with us. So we know it's in that period. It's not clear. It's also the case, and Professor Stamfer makes it clear, when it ends. It ends in the final decades of the Volozhin Yeshiva, in which the boys took on probably something that even in its most irreverent state should not have been, in which they make fun of the Nitziv's new wife, who was many years his junior, was apparently a very witty person, apparently a very pretty person as well, and was very, very vulnerable. And it's under her strong recommendation that the Nitziv ends the Purim Rav tradition in the Yeshiva in Volozhin. But in the meantime, it spreads to the Kamenetz yeshivas, to Slobodka, so to the Musar yeshivas, and others use it as a respite, as an opportunity to, again, give the students a chelek of the yeshiva. But at the same time, curricularly, it was a great tool for a feedback loop.
So the Nitziv's second wife was the Aruch HaShulchan's daughter, and that was their son, was Meir Bar-Ilan. But also another thing, it's good you answered that. I also was meaning to ask was, when did it take place? Meaning, when I was in yeshiva, we had a Purim Rav. It was the Friday night. Was before Purim. So what did they do? When they gave it each calendar year?
Interesting. I don't know. I don't know if we know that. I've seen many articles, memoirs about it. It's an interesting question. Did it most in YU? The Purim where I went to yeshiva. So the Purim Shpiel took place that evening. I imagine so. You imagine that's the appropriate time to have it. You don't want to have it. All bets are off after the Suda. So I imagine it had to be that evening.
Yeah, I'll because maybe when I was in yeshiva, not everyone was in yeshiva on Purim. It was only the oldest year. Everyone else went home. So it could be that was why. Maybe that's why they did it Friday night. I'm not sure. I wonder where
that's not my tradition. At YU, everybody stayed for the Purim Shpiel.
No, that's what I'm saying. So that's why they gave us Friday night.
Everyone was
there.
Yes,
that's but as opposed to Purim itself, not everyone was in yeshiva. They weren't there. So probably that's why it was like that. I don't know.
No. So right. So in YU, everybody stays for Purim. Certainly for that evening.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I don't think we talked about. Do we know? You did mention this, but the content is just the structure of the spiel was just general, like I said.
Yeah, in the European tradition that I'm aware of, it's the Purim Rav. It's a one-man show, a one-person act. That's very famously, there is a case in which none other than Rav Kook was appointed by the Netziv. This is obviously before it was canceled, to be the Purim Rav or Purim Gabbai, it's called different things, that year. And it turned out an Anikel, a grandson of the Netziv, was appointed to the Purim Rav and did a dynamite Rav Kook impression in America's Rav. Years later, and Rav Kook's only response was, "Well, you get what you deserve," for that invitation. The the so but mostly to allow also when you appoint the sharpest, wittiest, oftentimes best student, so-called, you can't see me with air quotes, student, it also is a greater license to allow for whatever irreverence is about to take place. So that's part of it. In America, a much more theatrical environment, it expands to a whole ensemble, to different acts and the like. But in Europe, it's not so complicated, so complex.
Right, and the content, like you said, the content is targeting like this year what's going on in yeshiva, making fun of like believe in the learning. It's general yeshiva related stuff generally.
Correct. Yeah. Eventually it's adopted by schools and it becomes a lampoon on the community and on the rabbi. Same idea, a controlled irreverence. But at the same time, yes, in the yeshiva, it looked inwardly toward the mechanics and the goings on and the personalities within the yeshiva.
Okay, now we get to America. You're like you said.
So it migrates to America. First at Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, Yeshiva University, Lakewood, Beis Medrash Gavoa very quickly adopted a Purim Rav. In the early going YU, it wasn't called YU until 1945, so it's a little anachronistic. They also had the Purim Rav. Tells, I'm told, although maybe rightfully, a historian can only work with primary sources. So nobody at Tells gives me any information on the substance of those Tells or Purim Shpiels and Purim skits. But apparently they started very early on, so I guess in the 1940s, to develop more theatrical performances and skits. And remember, Tells in that early time, the students who came there came from homes that were somewhat Americanized, not somewhat, were Americanized. And so to offer them that opportunity, well, with their backgrounds, remember, this is in the era of transitioning to television. So these the idea of not quite sitcoms, but performances and live or televised or recorded shows, we're at a moment at the beginning of the 1950s in which most Americans own at least one, likely two television sets. So they see those variety shows and they see an opportunity to transition Purim Rav into Purim Shpiel.
Now, you mentioned a couple of yeshivas there. So how did it look we talked about in Volozhin, how did it look in the American yeshivas?
So I can tell you, I personally own the transcripts of the Purim Shpiels from Skokie Yeshiva, where I was formerly the chief academic officer, from the early 60s until the 70s. And they are fantastic. They were all musicals. So instead of Bye Bye Birdie, it was Bye Bye Beardy. You had wonderful spoofs, spoofing Brisk to the World. Aaron Soloveitchik, of course, was there. You had all sorts of allusions to draft dodging in Vietnam, because when could you talk about it? And as a historian, this is wonderful because you see with such clairvoyance the attitudes of the students because they're allowed to, so they preserve this. So you have all these wonderful concocted synergies between American culture and yeshiva irreverence happening. And so the young men at to use their parlance, the Skokie Yeshiva, really take advantage of these. Some of the images parroting the Wizard of Oz, some modern day music, and in its height, 1,200 I think in 1971, 1,200 women and men buy tickets to attend the Skokie Yeshiva Purim Shpiel. And that, so they take it pretty far, but it flourishes. I'll say that Rapam, that Torah Vidas and Chaim Berlin resist it. In America, with an openness to culture, it was, even if it was just one day, its impact would exceed the limits of that 24-hour period. And so both Chaim Berlin and Torah Vidas, it's my understanding, resisted the Purim Shpiel. And today, I think you're seeing less of it, more and more, or pre-recorded spiels. You're seeing it in Israel yeshivas, the Shana Aleph, Shana Bet programs. But again, I think that it overstayed its welcome in some American yeshivas.
Right, I was telling you before that I learned in Philadelphia Yeshiva in Philly, and we did have a Purim Rav Friday night there. That's a Lakewood thing. So BMG.
It's Lakewood there. It's a Lakewood satellite. Exactly right. And what's interesting is that those yeshivas, they do it's part. That's why I said it's part of the curriculum. It's not just it's not an extracurricular thing. They take it really seriously.
Gotcha. Now, how about any others? You mentioned Skokie. Will you have any other stories or reports that were from then about spiels and other yeshivas?
So eventually, Ravan Soloveitchik, he curbed and heavily censored the Purim Shpiels in the yeshiva. They pronounce it the yeshiva. I was contractually obligated to pronounce it yeshiva. And by 1975, it had left from the province of the Beis Medrash folks and became a high school program. And again, a high school Purim Shpiel looks different. All of a sudden, do you trust? They're not college students or yeshiva students. They're high school students. So do you trust them that way? And it's an interesting change regime in the culture of Purim Shpiels. What's interesting is that Purim Shpiel makes it into the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, and Hebrew Union College. So the Reform and Conservative rabbinical programs also adopt Purim Shpiels. You see the Orthodox Union offering in some of their periodicals a template for how to conduct a Purim Shpiel in Orthodox shuls. Young Israel is reporting on Purim Shpiels, and all of a sudden, it's migrating from this curricular design of Reb Chaim of Volozhin, and it's become this ubiquitous thing that ought to happen on Purim, whether it's in an Orthodox yeshiva or not, whether it's in a yeshiva setting, a shul setting, a community setting. And I think something's lost. The more I think about it, something's lost when it moves that broad.
Yeah, like you said, I don't know if that becomes like Vietnam and it's taking on broad cultural issues. It's more than just what's going on in the yeshiva. And as you were saying, it was kind of a controlled, irreverent setting to get critique and feedback. It just becomes like a play almost. Is that what happened? Just becomes like a Purim thing, like the same way in American culture you have plays and things like that. So is that kind of what happens to it?
Right. So when it becomes something you have to do because it's Purim, because that's what we always did. Not so. Always did since the early 19th century. And you just let the guys go run wild. And it's no longer used as this clever form of reconnaissance that Reb Chaim Volozhin intended in his errors that Volozhin had intended for it. Then all of a sudden it's just it's just the Wild West for 24 hours and it loses its purpose. And then it's just uncontrolled irreverence, unchecked. It really was sort of an unspoken agreement between Rosh Hashiva and Talmud for the Talmud to offer feedback. That's what it was. And when it no longer becomes that, particularly in the United States, this is Rav Pam writes about this, it becomes problematic. All of a sudden, that's when you see a literature about whether or not it's you're guilty of committing Lashon Hara, for example, or not. All of a sudden, and whether or not it was Lashon Hara in the early 19th century is not my point. The fact that there's a growing literature, and I think one YU Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Daniel Feldman has written extensively on this. Once all of a sudden it finds itself in Shilas and Shuvas, it's not just that all of a sudden it's maybe a Chetz Lashon Hara. My point is that there is a need to control and check it much more than what it was originally done.
Now, another thing, if you have any other specific examples of old Purim Shpiels, you can mention. But you mentioned Skokie, where you were, and you have those transcripts. You have those. Um, how did that look? Especially, I think you talk about one of your articles, which we mentioned later. We can mention at the end about how, especially when Telz Yeshiva started in Chicago, what kind of there was like competition. What's kind of I don't know if it was competition in the Purim Spiel, but like if they have some sort of complex from Telz.
So, I mean, I don't know. So I do know that the satellite Telz Yeshiva in Chicago did operate Purim Spiels. What I did find, if you're trying to find, for example, if you're writing a history of the yeshivas in Chicago, where are you going to find? That's from a historian's point of view. Where are you going to find the tensions about the emergence of a new yeshiva, of the Telz Yeshiva migrating from Cleveland to Chicago? You're not going to find it in any sefer. You're not going to find it in any meeting minutes of the board, or certainly the Rosh Yeshiva didn't keep minutes of their conversations. You're going to find it in the Purim Shpiel. You're going to feel the anxieties in those scripts of what the students are really thinking. And that's exactly what happens in a lampoon, in a competition between the Skokie, I think it was in the context of a game show skit, between Skokie Yeshiva and Telz Yeshiva. That's where you found the young men at the Hebrew Theological College, Peace Measures of Torah, exercising grave concern over what it means to have another yeshiva in town. That's exactly where you're going to find it.
Yeah, I think you wrote out in 1965. They said how to succeed in the yeshiva without really trying. Then you said they debate suitable outfit. They could wear a tzitzis out. There's like a whole one of the articles. You have a whole song about
right. Do you follow the Magen Avraham or not?
Yeah.
So again, from a historian's point of view, it's just a wealth of a trove of information. And you see, like I mentioned, draft dodging. So it's no secret that went from Yeshiva University to Hebrew Theological College to every other yeshiva in between. Not many to the west in the West Coast, but at that point, they saw a spike in enrollment from young men who were trying to avoid being drafted and being scripted into Vietnam by enrolling in rabbinical school. That could be an exemption. And where do you find evidence of that? In the Purim Shpiel, because then what it allowed for was that some guys knew how to read a Reb Chaim. Some people didn't know what a Reb Chaim was. So that's where you find it, and you see that things that the young men wouldn't say to one another, all of a sudden, in the context, this is that tradition of Reb Chaim Volozhin, in the context of Purim Shpiel or Purim Rav, they were allowed to say, they were allowed to offend, they were allowed to vent their frustrations, and that was the great utility of the Purim Shpiel. It wasn't just about making people laugh.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned Skokie, you mentioned YU. Lakewood and other yeshivas, do you have any sort of record, any reports, any transfer, anything? Have you ever looked into that, of what was going on in those spiels, or no?
So I haven't found, I looked and I looked. If there are scripts, if there are memoirs of BMG, I would love to read it. I am told that we know that it was very difficult to understand Ron Cutler's shir. He spoke in a certain way, which is not very readily understandable. And I'm told that the Purim Rav, this was a recurring theme in the 1940s, 1950s at BMG, in which the Purim Rav would imitate Rav Aaron, and and they gave it to him a little bit. I'm told also is that Rav Aaron Cutler accepted it, that he cracked a smile, and that he understood whatever was intended. But of course, I'm also told that when the Purim Rav, who would always be lampooning, he would present himself as a Purim version of Rav Aaron Cutler. You didn't mess with Rav Aaron Cutler. He received tremendous kavod rav, and that allowed the Purim Rav tradition to persist in Lakewood, New Jersey. Not so in I think not if I'm incorrect, Rabbi Nassim Sherman, in a collection of his letters, writes about how difficult it was for the rabbinic faculty at Torah B'das to allow the Purim Rav or Purim Shpiel tradition.
Right, and you mentioned Rav Pam didn't, so Torah didn't have them?
It intermittently, and it was always fits and starts.
Gotcha. I mean, that really, like I said, in some yeshivas where I learned there still is, as far as I know, Purim Rav. So some yeshivas still have it, some don't. Today, kind of like less and less.
Less and less is my understanding. Sometimes it'll be pre-recorded, so it could be screened. Pre-recorded means that not there are advantages for not having the performance live. With modern day technology, you can include special effects. You do all sorts of different things, but it does allow for a degree of censorship and monitoring and oversight, and therefore it doesn't have that same effect. So in some ways, we've lost our way, I suppose. Is that the Purim Shpiel becomes sort of a checkpoint in yeshivas for Purim, but at its core, the Purim Shpiel really served a different purpose, and I think to some degree or another, it's sad. I think it's lost. That give and take.
Right. And if listeners have any other, personal recollection and their yeshiva have Purim Shpiel, I guess they can email you. You'd want to hear about more of
We
this.
got to collect them. Yeah, there has to be a repository of these Purim traditions, because I think, if you wanted to write a cultural or a social history of the yeshivas in America, to me, there's no better source base than those scripts. If they wrote them down, able to find them in Chicago, love to see more. I think that is a project, that is a dissertation, that is a podcast waiting to happen.
Yeah, well, listen, we're on the podcast, but and I want to jump back to Europe. Jump back for a second. We mentioned Volozhin, but it did spread to other yeshivas, right? Slobodka.
Yeah, it was in Slobodka. It was in the comic, became a whole system. Usually in the Purim Rav tradition. Usually that in adopting, and they intuited, or they well understood the intentions of Reb Chaim of Volozhin. They understood that this was a very useful tool to receive feedback. Yeah, so they're very popular.
Okay, now, if anyone wants to read about Purim Shpiel, what kind of reading is there? You mentioned you have some articles. You can mention your articles, anything else. We mentioned Stamfer's book.
Stamfer's book, I mentioned Rabbi Daniel Feldman has written voluminously on Hilchot Lashon Hara, and in it, in some of the works, in several locations, and some of his shiurim that are recorded on YU Torah, he presents the halachic aspects in responsive literature and tshuvos of Purim Shpiel. In my article, which I think appeared in the Journal of Chicago Jewish History, winter 2016, if I recall. So that, I think, is available online. But and you find it, yeah. There's a whole. That's just the beginning. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that there are many other areas to explore this, and it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Yeah, your article there's also one, like you wrote, a small one that's similar online that you wrote. I'll link to that. I'll link also to this one that you mentioned in the Chicago Jewish History. I'll put it now.
Oh, that's right. I wrote it for wider consumption. You're right. A shorter article. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, that one too. But this one, the longer one, has 22 footnotes. So there's some notes. There's some other sources, primary sources.
That's not very many footnotes.
No, it's not at all. It's not at all. But it's a small article, and people can check it out from there and see the sources that you quoted there if they want to see some more as well.
Right.
So
I think the citation for Rabbi Feldman, I can't say enough about Rabbi Feldman. He has lumdus of laughter toward a Jewish ethic of humor in developing a Jewish perspective on culture, which is, I think, one of the if I'm not mistaken, one of the Orthodox Forum volumes, I believe, in 2014. So that's where you can find some of his thinking and sources there. But yeah, I think if the listeners have materials, bring them forward.
Yeah, I'll put your email that people can email you. So actually, Rabbi Feldman, is you have that in footnote 11. Also, you mentioned prominent and fierce opposition from Rabbi Avram Pam in his Atar Lamelech. That's his shmuzim. So you do cite his Atar Lamelech. I guess that would be interesting to see. I did not look that up before the podcast, so Maybe I'll get a chance to look at that.
It's a couple sentences or two. It's not.
Yeah, I'm sure it's yeah. Exactly. Okay, listen, it's not a long podcast, but there was, it's very interesting, and like I said, maybe people have more to add to this and more of their own recollections and what they know. But let me ask you, while I have you here, what are you working on now? Any other new projects not related to Purim Shpiel?
Not related to Purim Shpiel. So, in time for the Super Bowl, I'm a good luck charm. When I moved to Boston, year 2, the Red Sox won the World Series. I didn't break the curse, but they were last in the division the year before we moved to Boston. I should say that when we got married, the second year the Yankees won the World Series, but that happens once every 4 or 5 years. We moved to Chicago.
Not anymore.
Yeah, not anymore. When we moved to Chicago in 2015, year 2, the Cubs win the World Series. That was something. In year 2, since moving to Philadelphia, taking the Helmet Gratz College, unfortunately, the Phillies came short. They made the World Series. But we'll see in a week and a half. Maybe my superpowers migrated to professional football. But why I bring that up?
Before I'm just going to throw this in. We are recording this. This is a Purim Shpiel. This is a podcast that will reach Purim time for the listeners. So you just said that. What if the Eagles lose the Super Bowl? So we'll find out what happens. But we're recording this before the Super Bowl.
So you'll find out before me then, right?
Continue. Yeah.
So I have a new book on football. It's something that I have never done anything like this before. It's called Dyed in Crimson, which is a story about the protagonist is a Jewish figure. His name's Arnold Harween, and together with a former mill hand immigrant from Ireland and a Catholic kid from Natick, Massachusetts, they transform Harvard. They win the Rose Bowl in New Year's Day, 1920, and then Arnie Harween, under the leadership of Bill Bingham, this person who should not have belonged. He's not a Boston Brahmin, somebody who descended from the Mayflower, taps Harween to be the coach of the Harvard Crimson. This is when they were the big three, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in college football. And he, amid terrible anti-Semitism, he rises through it and is incredibly successful. And I should also say, in between his playing days for Harvard and coaching them, he has to go by nom de plume. His mother doesn't want him attached to this seedy thing called professional football. So he has to go as McMahon. He has to go under a pseudonym. But he and his brother, the two Harween brothers, play for the Chicago Cardinals. And Harween actually in 1925 coaches them, wasn't the Super Bowl back then, but to one of the early championships. And so it's this wonderful story, untold, all true, about people on the margins. In the 1920s, Jews were certainly facing terrible anti-Semitism, and how people on the margins can influence the mainstream. It's this wonderful, I would say, feel-good story. But it's a true story about resilience, and it's something I haven't done before. So I used the historical context, but I let the story drive the book much more than the analysis.
Interesting. Not like American halacha or yeshiva related.
It's not about rabbinic authority in the Reform movement in the 19th century. It's not about peanut oil and Orthodox Jewish culture. Peanut oil on Passover, on Pesach, and as kidney oats. It is, I'm a huge football fan, huge sports fan. I used to attend growing up in Baltimore, I would attend opening day for the Baltimore Orioles. My mother worked in the law office of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles. And so we always had opening day seats. And I attended, I'll never forget it, in the rain, the very first time those miserable Pittsburgh Steelers came to town. And it was the inaugural season of the Baltimore Ravens, and we beat them. And I'll never forget the feeling. It was in Memorial Stadium. I actually had seats right next to we had great seats, you would think. We had in the first 2 rows. The problem was it was a baseball stadium, so it was positioned in a way that you couldn't see over the sidelines. So I couldn't see much, see the ball go up and down, Vinny Testaverde. But I'm a big Baltimore Ravens fan. And this was an opportunity. Also, sports writes really nicely. Right? There's ups and downs, there's winning and there's losing, there's necessary drama in writing about sport. So it was a fun project to take on.
Wow. Okay. So I guess I'll link to that also. And maybe we'll do a podcast on that if the listeners are interested in hearing about, like I said, more of a different kind of a thing, Jewish related, football related,
Would love to.
something interesting.
Great.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you very much for joining me once again.